Releasing intelligence. Have you noticed that what people say and what people do may not match? There may be a contrast between what they do and what they say. For instance, people may say that they value intelligence, yet seem to be quite terrified of the subject. They may harshly insist that whatever behaviors that they display are the ultimate height of intelligence. Whatever is already familiar to them is the limit of intelligence. Why are some people so anxious about whether other people agree that they are so intelligent? Why do they invest so much energy into ridiculing other interpretations for a so-called lack of intelligence? Why do other perspectives trigger so much distress for them? Why are they so desperately anxious for consensus, for silencing alternate opinions, or at least withdrawing from alternate opinions? I can tell you how it was for me when I acted those ways. I presented a pretense of having crossed a bridge beyond all naivety. My intelligence was perfect, at least according to me. Why was I so hysterically tense about other people's perceptions of my intelligence? I did not want them to know that I knew I still had much to learn. I did not want them to know that I was still curious. I did not want them to know that I still wanted to develop my intelligence further. I pretended in order to avoid their ridicule and harassment. In other words, I expected ridicule and harassment from people for uh, anything less than perfect intelligence. So I pretended to have perfect intelligence to avoid ridicule and harassment. I abandoned the cultivating of my intelligence in order to display ideas in conformity with what I perceived to be a consensus of opinion. So I would limit myself to whatever was popular. At some point in time, I would limit myself to whatever ideas were popular and avoid controversy, because it certainly can draw attention and create controversy to even question consensus ideas. So where did I get my ideas of consensus? It was the same for me as for most anyone else. In addition to several hours every day of mainstream media, I went to schools that programmed the students to set aside their own innate curiosity and then memorize specific content from the curriculum and then blindly repeat that specific content from the curriculum to receive social validation, approval, good grades, diplomas, degrees, and so on. We even had classes about science, in which we memorized and blindly repeated ideas and then claimed to be experts in science, certified experts, socially validated in our expertise. Did we conduct any experiments? Did we review and thoroughly critique the experiments that other people had conducted? Well, no, that's not the kind of science we were learning. In most cases, we were learning that memorizing and repeating an unexamined idea was science. I mean, if there was a consensus, if it's in the textbook, then we don't need to review any actual research or critique whatever research might have been presented as the proof. Because it's got a consensus support in the background, and we're being graded on just memorizing and blindly repeating that content. So what did we do? What did I do, and most anyone I was around, what did we do if someone challenged our competence in science? We hysterically defended our familiar presumptions. We were outraged at their insulting skepticism. In other words, we panicked. After all, everyone knows that every liver on the planet, where's the liver? Okay. Every liver on the planet makes a compound in order to poison the rest of the organism, right? Everyone knows that, right? Every liver on the planet, every species that has a liver, they all make a compound in order to poison the rest of the organism. Everyone knows that eating that compound, which everyone makes whether they eat any of it or not, everyone knows that eating that compound, which everyone makes, is also deadly, right? Everyone knows that. We do not need to review any research on the obvious dangers of cholesterol. It was in the book. We were graded on memorizing and repeating that. We had memorized what we were told and then blindly repeated what we memorized to receive social validation and social approval and social rewards for memorizing and repeating blindly our science lessons. Plus, the mainstream media constantly pumped hysteria and paranoia about eating cholesterol. So that must mean that if a chicken egg has a lot of cholesterol, then that's going to explain why all of the chicks that hatch out of chicken eggs are dead, right? Because there's a lot of cholesterol in a chicken egg, right? So that's why every chick that's ever hatched out of a chicken egg was dead, right? I mean, we did not need to look at evidence, okay? We had our textbook. Our teacher approved of the stuff we memorized and repeated blindly from out of the textbook. It was science. We did not need to conduct experiments. We did not need to thoroughly critique other people's experiments and research and logic. We were experts. And we had government certifications on the wall to prove it. My level of intelligence was already rated by the government as perfect. I got an A, 100%. Come on. Naturally, I did not really know much about the government system for rating intelligence, but if they said that my intelligence was perfect, and if I was ashamed about my actual level of intelligence at the time, well, then you can understand my panic and distress if anyone questioned the precision of our holy government's system for rating intelligence. I do not mind you insulting me, I might say, but do not dare insult our holy government and their intelligence rating system and their social validation and science classroom system. Come on, this is holy. Or those are the kind of things I might have said. To be clear, I was not jealous about the results that other people were attaining through their so-called scientific models and innovative models and so on. I was not jealous because I refused to pay attention to their heretical ideas and would discard any claim that they made because they were making claims that were unfamiliar to me. So, you know, those claims were contrary to my holy science lessons, so I just dismissed them. I ignored them. And their claims must be wrong because my intelligence was already rated as perfect, and I had a government certificate to prove it. My anxious panic was not an anxious panic because my anxious panic and distress was passionately defending the honor of our holy government and their intelligence rating system. Of course, if there ever was an imprecision in the science lessons of our holy government, hypothetically, then that must have been an innocent error. To consider any other alternative would be too shameful. So let's just move on. If there is ever any controversy about the precision of an old scientific consensus, then we must show our loyalty to the system by campaigning for reforms. That's right. You're familiar with this, aren't you? If there's ever any controversy about the precision of an old scientific consensus, then we must show our loyalty to the system by campaigning for reforms. We need to reform the educational rituals that program students to memorize and blindly repeat the various ideas of the curriculum and then call that process science. We need to reform those educational rituals, those programming rituals. How should we reform those programming rituals? We'll remove a few items from the curriculum and then replace those items with a few other items, some new content to memorize and blindly repeat. And then call that consensus science. See, we want to reform completely perfect the already perfect thing. You understand? Now, why did I stop pretending to have perfect intelligence? Now we're getting serious. Why did I stop pretending to have perfect intelligence? Or if I did not have a government certificate on the wall proving my perfect intelligence, then why did I stop pretending to have less intelligence than the powerful priesthood with government certificates on their wall? Right? Why did I stop playing dumb? Why did I pretend to have perfect intelligence, or why did I play dumb? It's actually the same answer. In some cases, I played dumb. In some cases, I had perfect intelligence. Why did I begin to stop the pretenses? Well, it was that eventually I was thoroughly disappointed by the results of the pretense. Of course, there was chronic physical tension from hiding my curiosity and blocking the physical display, the physical expressions that display curiosity, as in holding my tongue. Don't say anything, just So there was that chronic physical tension. But beyond the physical toll of suppressing my physical expression, I was just not getting the prosperity and health and happiness that I desired, that I valued. Of course, I pretended that I was getting all of this for a while. I mean, I had credit cards. But then I withdrew from those who seemed to lack the emotional stability for me to actually relax my pretenses in their presence without them panicking. So let's say they didn't have the emotional stability for me to just relax my pretenses in their midst without them panicking. Well, then I would diplomatically withdraw or undiplomatically withdraw. Either way, I withdraw. I began to relax all of the pretending that I had learned in order to fit in at school and at government jobs or any job where pretending and where playing dumb or pretending to be perfect would be useful. So I was exhausted from all the pretending. I gave up the facade because it was sabotaging me, limiting my results, instead of raising me up through the ranks of the government priesthood or the corporate priesthood. At first, I resisted the surrender. I didn't want to give up all my familiar pretenses that I was, I thought I was pretty good at them. Other people had different opinions, but at first I resisted surrendering. However, even as I layered new pretenses on top of the old ones, my inner anxiety only increased. It took even more energy, took even more holding of the tongue and more suppression. Even though I was a government certified expert in a few specialties, I had not actually developed a functional amount of competence in at least one of those specialties. So I might have loudly proclaimed my competence and confidence, but that was a cover for my shame and lack of confidence and anxiety. I didn't want people to find out my actual level of competence. I was ashamed and embarrassed. I did have a government certificate, though. So by then, I knew that I was naive. I was still terrified, though, if anybody mentioned it or even kind of hinted at it. I knew that humility would be required for me to cultivate curiosity and intelligence again. And I would need to stop pretending to already know everything. That would be humility. To admit that I didn't already know everything. I knew that courage was required for me to be humble. It was unfamiliar to me. I would need to start admitting to other people that I do not already know everything. And even, admit that I've been playing dumb when I've been playing dumb. I might even begin to relate to others as having valuable expertise, even though their expertise was not the same as mine, even if they didn't have a government certificate. I might respect their expertise and their experience and their results. They had great results. I might get interested in their methods and their logic. But that would mean assessing on my own their own competence. I'd have to assess their competence myself. I would not have the convenient method of simply finding out if they were certified by the holy government as being a perfect expert. I would have to accept my own naivety and my own, discernment as it was, however developed it was, and then select topics that appeal to me and then make my own observations and logically assess the observations made by others. Yes, I would have to actually develop logic and rational discernment. I would no longer rely on holy consensus by government certification as the only valid standard of credibility and expertise and competence and so on. Validity. Even if an idea was ridiculed in science classrooms or in mainstream media, it might be true. In fact, the more that an idea is threatening to the consensus and the more ridiculed it is, it may be that it is all the more likely to have some truth to it. Kind of the proportion of the passion to oppose it may be, and to ridicule it and shame it, may be the amount of truth to it. I'd have to withdraw from passionate debates about which hysterias and heresies were most important to reform or to protest against or prevent, to raise awareness about. I at least have to withdraw from some of them. There's so many. How can you do them all, right? I'd have to decline to enter those debates in the first place, or even stop actively seeking them out and starting them all the time. It'd be quite a change for me. I could stop competing to be perceived by others as the most intelligent around. The perfectionist of intelligence, and my um, loyalty to perfectionism, I could relax. In fact, I'd have to relax it. I could even stop gleefully pointing out every single error of mainstream media and schools. Possible errors, actual errors, biases, and so on. Perhaps they're systematically biased to focus only on certain subjects and not on others, plus to focus on those subjects only in certain ways. Maybe that's how it's going to be. Memorizing and repeating seem to be a really popular model in schools, and I wasn't really consulted on how to run them. The idea that schools are democratic institutions. Is that right? When I was a student, was my vote equal to the teachers? Did the teacher, how often did the students get to vote? I'm not saying it should be democratic, but it isn't. The court system, the legal system, the legislatures and executive branches of government, none of them are democratic. Even the legislators, although they get elected and then they have their own little democracy of voting, I guess you could say that's the democratic element of some governing systems. But when you have millions of people who elect hundreds of people, that's representative democracy. And then you have things like amendments and occasional ballot initiatives where people can directly have democratic influence, but that's pretty rare. The actual overall system of government is almost entirely established and not up for review and not up for popular vote. not up for legislative. Well, it may be up for a legislative vote in the sense of there could be amendments to the Constitution, and you know, a law could be repealed or a new law could be made. But as an overall percentage of things, what's the actual, influence of voting within a particular system? 2%, 9%, 14%? What is it? Is it realistic that there are other influences besides the actual voters, even if it's those, you know, the high priests that have their votes count more than everybody else's? Nobody else gets to vote on a certain issue, but the high priests, 50 of them or 300 of them or whatever, they get to vote. Even if those high priests' votes count, they only count so much, and there's other influences that are lobbying and campaigning to influence the voting of those high priests. And instead of having to appeal to the general public, special interest groups can simply control and regulate a few hundred high priests and dominate the democratic aspect of any system. So there's systematic bias. Special interest groups have favoritism towards them at the expense of the general public. That's what governments do. I'm no longer ashamed of my prior shame, my lack of power in reforming the system, my lack of effectiveness in my attempted reforms, or lasting effectiveness, even my lack of loyalty to the idea of perfectionist reforms. I've been embarrassed and ashamed and, anxious, and I'm not ashamed that I've experienced those things. I don't need to shame others for whatever I might call shameful, for their lack of loyalty, or for their promoting the wrong reform movement. There's a variety of reform movements, almost all of which are opposing some other reform movement, kind of making the great, stalemate of our holy democracy. Obviously, there is change over time, but there's a whole lot of conflict in a democratic process. For better or worse, it's a fact. So I was talking more important to me than democracy and the power of the individual, which obviously is very small. Go into a courtroom and, act like you have as much power as the jury or the judge. That's not how it works. I respect differences of power, and I respect shame. We can have shame about whatever amount of social power and social influence we have. I respect that. I respect that shame, and I respect all forms of shame. There is even an intelligence to shame. However, there's an intelligence to absolutely everything, every pattern of behavior. What if I perceive something as a possible threat? Well, then I may ridicule it. That might work well for me to push away the distraction and disruption of my own naivety being exposed. If I'm jealous of someone and I want to discourage them from competing with me or exposing my shame, then it can be effective to ridicule them, to shame them, to intimidate them, to slander them. To protect me from the threat that I perceive, shaming them might work, right? However, intimidating one possible threat will never resolve the general vulnerability to that kind of threat. If I'm interested in resolving my vulnerability to the exposure of my naivety or incompetence or disappointment or whatever I'm trying to hide, or whatever I've been trying to hide, then the ultimate solution is to develop competence, expertise, stability, security, emotional maturity, financial stability, social um, stability, but social connectedness, you know. Um, if I'm concerned about abandonment or exclusion from a group, ostracism, lots of strong connections and bonds tend to reduce the vulnerability to a particular, you know, blackmail of I'm gonna, you know, I won't be your best friend anymore if whatever. So all of this was introductory comments to really, you know, give you a sense of where I'm coming from and lead up to a new bridge. What benefits will we cultivate? Through my experimentation and research, I found some unfamiliar methods that produced appealing results. These were not methods that were publicized through mainstream media or mainstream schools. I'd like to share these methods with you. Maybe certain ones in particular are of most interest to you. Great. Perhaps you will even have some results to share that are even more attractive in some particular field or topic. Also, for those who simply wish to release their own suppression of their own intelligence, you can benefit from programs that provide exactly what you value most. This releasing of intelligence, releasing of pretense as well. We can play with pretense, playfully, jokingly, amusement, for amusement. We can also let go of pretense. But the idea of releasing intelligence is that we've been suppressing it. We've been conditioned to suppress it, and we can release that suppression. And by relaxing the suppression, the intelligence will then be blossoming at a rate that might not have been the case since we were very young, even before we entered schooling programs. So to continue, there's a link you can click to find out more about those benefits.